The Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I'm your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. So God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. It was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and a lord of all his house and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt, so come down to me and do not delay. You will settle in the land of Goshen, and you will be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. And I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. So you must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry, bring my father down here.' And then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him." Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. We're taking a trip in the Wayback Machine this morning. We've been reading through the gospel texts, and we've been following, for the most part, at least since Advent, a roughly chronological structure that has brought us to a point in Jesus' adult life when we have the opportunity to see him actually in action. Up until this point, Jesus has kind of been talked about, talked around, and it's only until recently that we've actually seen him as an adult with some agency. So we're leaving Jesus behind now that we've gotten him to adult years, and we're going back in time, way, way back in time. Reading the lectionary can sometimes feel like channel surfing, and I realize that. So this morning, when we read the lectionary passage, you might have felt like, well, this is the climax of a story that I didn't read because we were reading all this Jesus stuff, but now we're back over here. I was watching HBO, now I'm watching Showtime. What's happening? I'm confused. So let's catch up. This lectionary passage tells the story, or concludes this part of the story, of Joseph, he of the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. Joseph was the son of Jacob and his brothers who were jealous of him, maybe for good reason, maybe because he was an arrogant little punk. We'll talk about that later. But for whatever reason, they're not such a big fan of Joseph, and they decide to sell him into slavery. Ultimately, a series of almost Forrest Gump-like circumstances where he keeps accidentally finding himself in the right place at the right time. The next thing you know, he's playing ping pong with Pharaoh. But he becomes what we call the Vizier of Egypt, which was an actual title. We're not sure if a person named Joseph existed historically, but the role, at very least, existed, and it really was as powerful as the scriptures would have us believe. So this Hebrew, this non-Egyptian, this outsider, has, through this remarkable series of circumstances that began with his own slavery, wound up in the Pharaoh's house. This is kind of an exciting moment for Joseph. But then he's promptly thrown into jail, and it isn't until another Pharaoh comes along and he's able to essentially do some interpretation, some dream work for the Pharaoh, that the Pharaoh realizes there's something special about this guy. And so he preserves him and elevates him to this status where he now has an opportunity, Joseph, to reunite with his brothers after all this time. That's the short version. To be honest with you, what they did to Joseph doesn't matter so much. It was a different time. People were sold into slavery. It was a way to deal with your problems. If you had someone in your family that you felt was weak or undesirable, it was a way to make a buck off of them as opposed to just abandoning them like the Greeks and the Romans would often do. Just sort of leave the baby out on the doorstep. But no, we could sell them into slavery and make a little money off it, and we're also dealing with this issue of our brother that we have this dispute with in our family. There are a couple of interpretations as to the kind of person Joseph was. I want to look at both. One interpretation is that Joseph is sacred, holy, and blessed, and his brothers can't stand it. That's a pretty favorable interpretation of Joseph, by the way. We don't actually know much about what his brothers experience in his home, except for the fact that favoritism, namely their father's favoritism to Joseph, creates a weird dynamic in which they are clearly not as beloved. And meanwhile, Joseph is having dreams where he sees himself elevated over his brothers, and he tells them that he has these dreams. What are you doing, man? That's something you keep to yourself. Did you have any dreams last night? No. No, slept like a baby. But for whatever reason, he tells them. So maybe he has an arrogance problem. I don't know. I just want to acknowledge that, at least in terms of the history of interpreting this passage, there have been multiple ways of looking at it. But either way, whether you feel like he earned it or not, whether he had it coming or not, his agency, his dignity, his humanity are taken away from him. And they, for many, many years, are not given back. And that's an important detail when reading this passage, because this lectionary actually begins with this passage, just so you know. I didn't cherry pick the section that I like the most. But if I were cherry picking the section that I like the most, this would be an easy go-to, because it's all about forgiveness. It's all about reconciliation. Joseph says to his brothers, there's this place called Goshen. It's in the East Nile Delta in Egypt. It's not technically part of Egypt's borders, but it's kind of adjacent to it. You can go there, you can live there, I'll look after you. I want you to be healthy, whole, and safe. But notice what has changed. Joseph has all the power. So when reconciliation finally happens, it happens on Joseph's terms. Oftentimes when we read passages having to do with forgiveness, particularly in the context of a religious community, the obligation is placed on you as the individual to do all of the work of reconciliation. And we say that it's part of your faith journey, it's part of your character building, that you need to learn to work toward forgiving someone who has wronged you. And to a certain extent, that's true. Christ says to show mercy and love and forgiveness to others so that we can receive love and mercy and forgiveness in return. That levels the playing field a bit. But forgiveness and what happens in the passage this morning, which is reconciliation, are two different things. And they're not necessarily intricately linked. In other words, you may have forgiveness without ever having reconciliation. And that's an important distinction. What's happening in the passage this morning? Well, the tables have been turned. Someone who didn't have power now has power, and that person then gets to decide how they're going to approach this relationship, this broken, dangling thread of a relationship. Joseph gets to choose. He has that autonomy. He got his dignity back. He got his humanity back. He got his freedom back, or at least he's now having that dignity, that humanity, and that freedom acknowledged by others. And that creates the conditions necessary for him to reconcile with his brothers because the power imbalances have been equalized a little bit. This is why it's important for us to understand the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Because reconciliation is really only possible when things have been reconciled. When inequities and imbalances and things that were wrong have been in some sense repaired or at least addressed to the extent that human beings can. That's deeper than forgiveness. I would argue that we are obligated to forgive. We're not necessarily obligated to reconcile. Mostly because reconciliation isn't always possible. Those dynamics can't always be rectified. Those broken pieces can't always be healed, at least in our life, in our understanding. Forgiveness is a matter of erasing the debt. It's saying, I'm not going to hold you responsible for this. It doesn't repair anything. It doesn't, as Shannon put it, rubber band us closer together. It doesn't do any of that. It's just for your benefit, really. Forgiveness is for you. It may help begin the process of reconciliation, but at the end of the day, to forgive someone is to say, you owe me something and I choose not to observe that debt. You wronged me in some way, and I'm acknowledging that. I'm not saying you didn't wrong me. I'm just saying that we're moving on. That may not necessarily mean that our relationship is repaired, but we're moving on. But reconciliation, the straightening of the ways, the real process of making things whole is a lot harder. And it takes mutual work on both sides. I haven't talked about Black History Month this month, and the reason I haven't talked about Black History Month this month is because I'm a white dude, and it's Black History Month, and the token is to talk about Black history during Black History Month, and I really hate doing that because it makes it seem as if we're not allowed to talk about things like race relations and reconciliation and those kinds of things any other time of year. But the lectionary passage is just too perfect to pass up. Earlier this week, we were on vacation, but we were still getting the news, and we were following the Jussie Smollett thing, the actor from the television show Empire, who appears to have faked a hate crime in order to, for all intents and purposes, get a raise. And there was some talk about how, depending on how this whole thing shakes out, it could potentially set back race relations for however many decades. Because now we have this excuse. We can say, well, someone faked it, so perhaps most hate crimes or all hate crimes are fake. It's a weird sort of whataboutism that kind of gets us into this thing where we don't have to listen to potential suffering because we have an excuse now. Well, I don't have to pay attention to that because it was fake one time. We did that with global warming, and look where it got us. Ignoring the problem doesn't necessarily make it go away, but we are tempted at times to do that. And it's not just race reconciliation, race relations. I think about the relationship between queer people and straight people. If you're still one of those folks who says, well, I don't mind it, but I don't want to see it, guess what? You still got some work to do. That's part of the work of reconciliation. It's not just sexuality, it's not just race, it's gender dynamics. I was thinking too, there was a story about a rock musician that I used to listen to quite a bit named Ryan Adams. He was married to Mandy Moore, the actress, the pop singer. They were together for many, many years. Suddenly, very abruptly, their relationship ends a few years ago. And then, a couple days ago, a story breaks that she was the victim of at least emotional abuse, if not much more than that, and that she wasn't the only woman who'd experienced these dynamics at the hands of this man. So it's gender reconciliation too, because for so many years, basically since human beings have existed, inequities have also existed. And so we have to begin the work of drawing in closer to the center, drawing in closer to one another. I don't mean the political center, I just mean drawing in closer to one another. It's not just a matter of saying, well, I forgive you, with something as deep and traumatic as historic race relations in this country, for instance, or gender dynamics. Some people may roll their eyes and say, well, why are you so triggered? And then I point to the last however many hundreds of years that human beings have been doing things the way we've been doing them, and I say, well, that's why. There's a lot of reasons to still be upset in the world. There are lots of things that need that reconciliation. And it's mutual. It requires all of us to chip in. You can't say, well, I didn't cause that problem, so I don't have to fix it. Joseph didn't cause the famine. He still got his hands dirty. He did the work necessary to protect his own family, and he went a step further than that, too. As the vizier of Egypt, he actually was able to help them shore up for the famine. That's the only reason Goshen had food in the first place, is because Egypt still had food, because the famine was so rough. So just because you didn't cause the problem doesn't necessarily mean you won't solve it, or at the very least, you won't help to reconcile things just a little bit more. Here's the thing about the word Goshen, and I'll end on this note. We don't know what it means. We have no idea what the word means. There's a lot of theories. It's a real place. The borders have changed, of course, over the years. It doesn't exist in its form anymore, but that word has been around for a really, really long time. And so there are lots of theories. It shares roots with other words. And biblical scholars are nerds, so we love looking at this stuff. And they were picking over it and trying to figure out, what does this word mean? Two things about the word Goshen. The first is that it's a word that, depending on the root, means abundance or fullness. So there's one theory that Goshen just means a land of plenty. There's another theory that Goshen shares a common root with another word for labor. Do you see where I'm going with this? We want to live in a world in which there is grace for all people, but it doesn't happen like that. We want to live in a world in which all things are reconciled, but you don't flip a switch to make it happen. It takes work. It takes community. It takes self-reflection. How have I contributed to the inequities? Joseph's brothers had to feel that shame, and that was a good thing. There was holiness in that shame, because it propelled them to move past the shame into reconciliation. Shame isn't always a problem. Guilt isn't always a bad thing either. Too much of it can be a bad thing. But if, spurred at the very least, maybe let's not call it guilt, maybe let's call it conviction, spurred at the very least by the Spirit of God in our world, we see all of these loose threads, all these loose ends that need tying up. And perhaps each and every one of us is a Joseph in our own right, is called for such a time as this, to go ahead maybe of the next generation and make the world a little bit better for them, a little fuller, a little safer, and then maybe, if not in this lifetime, then maybe in the next, when it's quiet, when people are free, all people, when people have dignity, all people, maybe finally we will experience in its fullness grace in Goshen. Amen.